Hey creeps, it's Horror Free For All. Continuing my passion project I like to call Gems from the Crypt, a series where I look at films that feel like full feature-length episodes of one of my favorite horror anthology shows ever made, Tales from the Crypt. Now, this movie in particular for this video, I never heard about until I was out and about hunting at my local antique store. There was a vendor there that had a bunch of old VHS tapes, and this movie caught my eye, and I looked it up on Letterboxd and saw that people really liked it. I also saw that it had Tim Matheson in the movie, which is one of my favorite actors I love seeing in movies, because he normally plays small bit roles, but in this film, he was given a mainstay role. Kind of like one of my White Horse favorite movies to ever come out, a very Brady sequel that he stars in. Now, this film came out in 1990. This was around the time where Tales from the Crypt on HBO was starting to take off, but this film actually came out on the USA Network. It was written by Mark Patrick Carducci based on a story by David Davies, and it was directed by Frank Darabont. And Frank Darabont was a household name in the 90s with films like The Green Mile and The Shawshank Redemption. And as of recent, he was tied to a very popular television show on AMC called The Walking Dead. The film in question we're going to be looking at today is Buried Alive. Now, I actually have here the VHS copy that I got from the antique store. And I know recently Kino Lorber put out a Blu-ray of this film that I don't own in my collection, but I'm happy to have the VHS nonetheless. Now, for those of you wondering, yes, Buried Alive did have a sequel made in 1997 that's actually directed by Tim Matheson, who had pretty big shoes to fill after Frank Darabont kind of left his mark. But we'll get into that movie at some other point. Now, what perplexes me most about Buried Alive is that this was a straight-to-cable, made-for-television movie with like a $2 million budget. Now, I don't know if they made returns on this investment with advertisements and, viewership. Maybe home media release might have helped it. But it did garner a sequel, so I imagine that there was some sort of relevancy still there. You see, the 90s was a peculiar time. There was long dormant movie franchises like When a Stranger Calls. They got a straight-to-cable sequel that was called When a Stranger Calls Back. There was Trilogy of Terror 2 that came out in, I think, 1997, which was a long-awaited follow-up sequel to Trilogy of Terror, which I think came out in 1978. And the list goes on, but that should give you an idea that in the 90s, straight-to-cable thriller/horror movies were all the rage. And I think I've mentioned this in the past, particularly with movies like Terror Tract and some other reviews I've done recently, that in the 90s, there was a growth and a need of a market that was starting to brew in the home media circuit. Whether it be cable television needing new and original source material so they can save money on perhaps leasing the movies and trying to acquire airing rights for it for a period of time, or they were looking for avenues to market straight to video. Now, with a cable network that's owned by a big media corporation, I think USA was owned by Universal, they had a home video distribution market in place, and they also had a cable distribution network in place. So Universal was arguably set up the best out of most of them around this time. As a matter of fact, I think Universal dominated VHS sales in the early 90s, and you can look these numbers up, probably next to Warner Brothers, because they just had the resources at the time to be able to do so. And it wasn't until much later where other studios started to see the performances they were doing. And I think part of that was because they had their hands in all the cookie jars. They were involved in home media distribution and marketing straight to video content. And they were also on the cable side of things marketing straight to cable content. So where am I getting at with this long-winded spiel? Why am I talking about a 1990 straight to cable movie for this playlist? Well, Buried Alive, directed by Frank Darabont, I should reiterate that, feels the most like Tales from the Crypt out of anything I'll probably ever cover on this channel for this playlist. Now, Buried Alive is a very simple story to follow. So the story involves a man named Clint. Now, Clint is a hardworking man. He has built his wife, who is played by Jennifer Jason Leigh, a dream home of sorts out, I think, in California in a rural part of the state. Now, his wife is from the big city, I think, of New York. She did not necessarily want to leave the Big Apple and move out in the middle of nowhere on the opposite side of the country, but she did so because she's married to this man, and as we learn in the movie, she's more after his money. Now, as we see Clint trying to make the best of the situation, knowing that his wife isn't all the way happy living there, and he's trying to make it as best of a transition as possible. So he heads out one day to, run some errands and check up on his business that I think he's also moved out this way, or maybe he's found himself in a new business. That's beyond the point. Well, we learn pretty early on that Jennifer Jason Leigh's character is having an affair, and she is seeing this doctor who has a collection of exotic fish in his bedroom, let's just say. And after they get it on and are having their, after sex talk, the guy essentially comes up to her with a proposition about how she can get out of this marriage and how they both could benefit from that, because there's some money to be had and there's some happiness to be had if the husband's out of the picture. So he hands her a vial of fish poison, of a fish that they actually ate for dinner at their rendezvous, let's just say. And he tells her that if the husband ingests this poison, he's going to pretty much die suddenly, and they can have a quick funeral and, bury the body. And then once that's all said and done, then they can get quick access to the money, and they can get out of this godforsaken town, as they think, and go live up a life in luxury with all the coin. So the wife, of course, contemplates this and is very hesitant at first. And we see her take home this poison, and she deliberates on it for, a couple of hours. Once the husband gets back home, we see that she maybe tries to have sex with him to see if there's some emotions there that could possibly lend to her not going through with this premeditated murder. But after the sexual encounter, and after they get to talking and get to having dinner, she realizes very quickly that there's a reason why she's been having an affair on her husband, and it's because she doesn't really love him anymore and only sees him as a piggy bank. So she decides to put some poison in his wine glass and waits to see what happens. Let's just say this possibly works. And the husband, of course, realizes that something is very wrong. And the wife just sits there and watches her husband, according to her, in the moment, die. Now, once the police arrive on scene, we're cued in that the doctor that the wife is having an affair with is actually a medical examiner for the police. And the other police officer is a good friend with the husband, who has presumably died. And he looks very heartbroken over the situation, but he can't put his finger on the pulse yet, but he has some sinking suspicions that something's going on with the wife, and that may play a role later on in the story. Now, from this point, we are shifted over to the guy that the woman is having an affair with, and he's in contact with the funeral home where they take the husband's body, and he essentially addresses that The family wants a turnaround funeral. They want the cheapest casket possible to save money. Can you do it? And the funeral home at first is like, okay, that's a weird request. But then they look at the cost saving aspect to it and knows how loaded this family is and how much money they could make by cutting corners. So they go ahead and respect those wishes. They even go as far as to not even, embalm the body and drain the bodily fluids, which is against practice. But then again, it all feeds into the plot, because if this happened, there would be no rest of the story. Well, of course, we get to the funeral of the husband, and the wife is putting on a show in front of all the husband's, family and friends that turned up there. And even her, guy that she's seeing happens to stop by to give some fake crocodile tears. We see the husband get buried, and the wife and her lover go back to her house, and they get it on to celebrate. Well, unbeknownst to them, I haven't mentioned this yet, there is a dog that's on the property that really loves the dead husband, to the point where he's mourning and crying out in the rain. And the wife, being the big bitch that she is, takes a shotgun and shoots at him, to get him to shut up, because she hates the dog. Well, by shooting at him, it opens up the gate, and the dog runs to the graveyard. And while he's on top of the grave, barking and, wishing that his owner was alive, we see the presumably dead husband wake up inside of this cheap casket underground. And water is leaking from the rain. And if he doesn't get out soon, he's either going to drown, asphyxiate, or have a combination of both. Luckily for him, he's able to scrape himself out of the coffin through the soil and gets out alive. Once he realizes where he is and he notices that he's covered in mud and is in a suit, he figures that they must have thought that he was dead. So he goes back to his house to see, what the situation might look like, and notices that his wife is indeed with another man. And he starts to think and recollect about things that his wife was telling him in the story. And this sets him off. And in a justifiable way, he decides to get back at them. Now, this is where the story takes a 180 from what you might expect. This is where the Tales from the Crypt aspect come into play. Well, the wife made a comment to him early in the story, I haven't mentioned this part yet, that the house is too big for her and that it feels like a maze, and she feels that she can get lost easy in the house. So he takes it upon himself to actually make that house a maze. And in order to do so, he needs the wife and her lover locked down in the basement for, a decent amount of time so he can accomplish his goal. So he arranges a plot to trap him down in the basement. Well, we don't really see what the husband is doing, but we do see him demolishing some walls and putting up some new plywood and drywall. That implies that maybe he's doing some renovations upstairs. And when it's time for the gerbils to run the rat race, let's just say, he opens up the basement door and lets them free. And we see an over-the-top fight sequence that may or may not result in the death of one, and the other gets stuck inside the maze. Well, this culminates into the climax of the story, where we see the husband make a decision involving the house. I'll just leave it there. So, Buried Alive, to me, is a very straightforward movie about revenge. But peeling back from the topical layer, we start to see some pretty deep thematic messages in its story. While some of these messages have been overdone in media, especially around this point of time in movies when thrillers were becoming a big mainstay in Hollywood in the 90s, I still think that this movie executes them well, and some of these messages are still relevant today. The obvious one that you can take away from the story is, vanity versus sustainability. The husband is rich. He has a lot of money. He's affluent. He has enough play to move his life from, the Big Apple of New York City out to rural California and still be as affluent as he is. Yet, we see his actions in the story reflect that he cares less about money. All he ever wanted was a life with his wife and having a family. Yet his wife wanted the exact opposite. Now, this could be a typical morality play that is very synonymous with EC Comics and Tales from the Crypt, where it often depicts women as gold diggers and money chasers, let's just say. The wife in this story, played by Jennifer Jason Leigh, is no different to that archetype whatsoever. However, I like her inclusion in the story and how she's depicted because the stark contrast of her character versus essentially what the husband becomes once he rises out of the grave and is reborn in a figurative sense kind of shows how the visage of marriage is actually the thing that died and not the husband. You see, the husband started to see right through the lies and started to see the truth in his wife's words, even though he might have been listening and wasn't really listening to her. He's starting to see the big picture in it all. And the wife, instead of, doing the honorable thing and divorcing them and taking 50%, she wanted it all. And she let her lover get into her ear and feed her sweet nothings that ultimately did nothing for her in the end. I'm going to say this up front. I think Tim Matheson's acting, as well as Jennifer Jason Leigh's acting, and the actor of the lover, and I don't know his name off the top of my head, I think it's William Atherton, did a fantastic job playing these roles in such a small cast of a movie here. Tim Matheson's character in particular, going from this likable guy to this silent, grieving man after he's risen out of the grave is very palpable. And you don't get much dialogue with him in that second half of the movie, but I think that was done on purpose because he's living in silence. He's living in his mind, and he's living in his own grief, in his own mindset of revenge. And that, to me, was so intriguing, and it made me think about the situation and how I would act if I was put in that similar situation. And I loved it for that because it just felt authentic to me. Now, there's some over-the-top moments in this story, like him building a maze in his house. And I think the movie said it was done in like 8 or so hours that, he trapped his wife and her lover down in the basement for. It could have been longer, but I think it was that amount of time. And if it was, holy crap, this guy was really busy upstairs. But I really love that the movie went that ridiculous stretch to kind of emphasize how extreme emotions can be. And I think that him going through all of this trouble just really cements that at the end of the day, this is what he was doing all along for his wife. He was giving her her dream home, and now that he's finally starting to listen to her saying that this house is a maze, he wanted to give that to her, to actually show her that that's what it is, and make her see that her words and her actions have consequences. I don't know. I just think that this movie has a brisk pace to it. It's very lean. It gets right to the point, right to the nitty gritty. There's no offshoot plots that don't matter in the plot. It's definitely a movie carried by character narratives. Yes, the wife and the lover suck as characters, and we spend a lot of focus with them in the movie. But in that back half, when we get more of a focus with the husband at times, the husband comes in and out of the story in a very genius way. And I don't know if Frank Darabont did this on purpose, but the husband is kind of that looming figure that we know is there, but we don't know necessarily what he's planning on doing to his wife and her lover, which makes the waiting and the anticipation that much more exciting because we know it's building to something, but we don't know necessarily when it's going to happen or exactly how it's going to play out. And that, to me, is how you make a good thriller movie. If anything holds this movie back, I would say is probably the budget. It feels a bit too small scale at points. And if I'm being honest, the set piece of the house itself, I can't tell if they actually filmed in a house on location or they built a small set to film the movie in. But there's a good amount of scenes in and around the basement of the home. And to me, the basement just looks a bit stale for this specific movie setting. If you ask me, I kind of wish that the movie spent more time with the house itself and perhaps lean more into the husband trying to booby trap the house. Yes, it would have been way more ridiculous to go with more over the top traps and mazes and whatnot and possibly fuck with them in a slapstick kind of way. But I actually think that would have worked in this movie given all the buildup and context. Maybe some extra minutes of seeing these fuckers suffer because of the shitty things that they've done to this man would have been more entertaining and, a hoorah moment for the audience. But I digress. I still think what we got in this movie, nonetheless, was pretty serviceable, but I think the budget was definitely holding back some potential there to do more with the concept. And I'm going to say this. Frank Darabont knows how to make a good movie. And there's some really fun scenes in this film that are very cool on a technical level. Like there's a scene where we see soil and we cut down from the soil with the camera down to the coffin, and there's multiple angles that we see Tim Matheson trying to escape this coffin and break his hand out of the soil up top. That shit looked cool as hell. This shit was incredible. I'm even gonna give props to the soundtrack department. For a straight-to-cable movie, the soundtrack in this film was pretty impressive, and I think it did elevate some tension at points. If I had to say one last thing about Buried Alive, going back to the Tales from the Crypt aspect to this movie, the reason why I think this movie captures it the best way is that it paints a neat picture of who to like, who to dislike, and it makes the morals obvious and to the point. I'm not going to go rehash what I said earlier, but I think that what made Tales from the Crypt so popular is that we as the audience got to live vicariously in these over-the-top ridiculous situations with characters and forget about reality. Now, Tales from the Crypt was very grounded in reality, but the absurdity of the situations characters would find themselves in was the dividing point between us connecting our reality to that reality and being able to use the episode or stories in question as true escapism. Buried Alive connects the soft tissue like that show did very well, and it is a blast from start to finish, and it feels like a Tales from the Crypt episode or a Lost episode or some set thereof. I think this is a perfect movie for Tales from the Crypt fans to sink their teeth into, especially if you've never seen it before. Now, I haven't seen the sequel. I don't know why there was a sequel made to this movie. It was pretty much perfect as is, but I'm morbidly curious because Tim Matheson comes back apparently, and he's also the director of it. So we'll get there when we get there. If I had to rate this movie from a 0 to 5 star basis, for a straight-to-TV movie, this is pretty much as good as you're going to get. If I'm going to be fair, and this is my ceiling for it, I'd probably give this film a 4.75 out of 5 stars. And it's a shame that this movie has gone unnoticed over the years. I think, in my opinion, if this film got remade in like a theatrical version today, it wouldn't be as special as it is. So I'd rather it be that undiscovered hidden gem that nobody knows about than some creator seeing its genius, wanting to recreate it for the masses, and the masses kind of turn against it because at the end of the day, movies like this succeeded in the 90s because it had charm. And modern movies, I don't think could pull off the charm that this film had in the same way. With all that said, that's my thoughts on Buried Alive. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this movie before. What's your thoughts on the film? Until next time, take care.